Good morning. Sure good to be together this morning, worshiping our God, to sing praise to Him, to examine ourselves, to make sure that we're living lives that are pleasing unto our God. This morning we're going to start a two-part, two-lesson series. Basically this morning we're going to be looking at ways that we are not to act or treat our elders, ways that we should not behave toward them. Whereas next Sunday, Preston will do a lesson more focused on the positive things, what we can do to help our elders. And hopefully, by the time that we combine the two lessons, we'll have a better understanding of how it is that we can make their jobs a little bit easier, how we can make their jobs even maybe more joyful. But looking at Absalom, it is a very good example of an individual who had what we might call undermining tendencies. You see, Absalom, in his mind, he had thought out a plan. He had really considered different ways that he might be able to overthrow King David, to steal his kingdom, essentially. And he actually executed this plan pretty well. And he had this plan, and he went through with it and caused all kinds of trouble, but was able, just as Casey just read for us, to steal the hearts of the people. Now, when you think about that and you consider, okay, well, how does that apply even to Christianity today? And how might that apply even to our relationship with our elders? Well, even if we don't do it intentionally, maybe it's the case that we do it unintentionally, and we're not even aware that we're actually doing these things, but we might also have undermining tendencies, things that we do that might make their jobs a little bit more difficult. And we might even ask the question, and it's one that we need to consider at least. You think about people who might be considering stepping up into a position of leadership. Do my actions possibly make that decision more challenging for them to make? Do things that I do in my life, in my Christianity, make people think, man, I don't know if I would want to serve in that capacity? And I don't think that any of us would do that intentionally, right? Would have that kind of behavior, but it's at least something that is a possibility. And something that we need to consider in how we show respect and how we treat our eldership. Now, let's go back and let's read verse 1 of chapter 15 again, and we'll go through here and draw out points and try and make application as it applies even to us and things that we don't need to do to our leadership. Chapter 15, verse 1 says of 2 Samuel, "After this had happened, that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him." Now, we don't need to seek undue attention, right? We understand that. Now, consider Absalom in this situation. I understand the chariots. I understand the horses. He's the son of a king. It's probably very natural for him to travel in this fashion. But did he really need the 50 men to run before him? What was the purpose? Right? He's trying to present himself as this man of authority, right? He's the son of a king. They know who he is. Yet he is putting himself out there. He's projecting himself out there to plant a seed of thought. And we'll see it as we move through the text, but what he's doing is beginning to make the people see him as this man of authority. And we have to be careful that we don't also try and seek undue attention. But rather, we need to be concerned about humility. In Matthew chapter 23 and verse 12, Jesus said, "And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now, was he using humility in this scenario? Or was he exalting himself and wanting all the benefits that come with it, projecting himself out before the leadership, trying to plant this seed of thought into people's minds? Now, as it relates to a congregation, I'll put me and Preston out there first. Who is most likely to turn and trying to shed light on themselves within assembly of a congregation, within the congregation? It's more likely the preachers might end up doing this. And with the world mindset of what a congregation is supposed to be, they look often at the preacher as if they're the leadership, but they're not. We just the same are serving underneath the eldership who shepherds the flock. And pride is a vice that is extremely destructive and has the potential to produce all kinds of destructive behaviors. And it's easy to try and project ourselves out in front of other people, even if we are doing it unintentionally. Now, the proper order of things as it relates, yes, we're supposed to be a light in this dark world, right? You think about Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14 and following, the example is given for us. The standard is presented for us. We are to let God's light shine into this world. That city that's set on a hill is going to illuminate so much that the people around it, they see it and they're drawn to it. Just the same, he says that we are not like putting a basket over a lamp to make it not be able to shed its light, but rather put it in a position so that the light can spread all through the room, right? We are to let our light so shine before men that we glorify our Father which is in heaven. That ultimately is the goal. That's what we are trying to do. Now, as it relates in someone trying to shed light on themselves, you know what they can actually do? All of a sudden you can take and you can kind of put up reflectors, right? We're letting the light of Christ shine in our lives so that people can see it. You can put reflectors out there and try and draw that light back to yourself. Put yourself in the spotlight, kind of seeking the limelight type mentality. It's very easy for a preacher to do this. What do you think the elders would say if me and Preston went to them and said, you know what? I think we need to change the sign out there. I think we need to put our names on the sign out front and then put Church of Christ underneath it. What do you think they would think of that? Right? That's trying to turn the light back on ourselves. Or maybe we might say the super stuff bio, right? Overflowing with all the extras. A preacher comes in to speak and he has his bio and all of a sudden has everything that he's done throughout his entire life rather than just really focusing on the main things. You see, we can turn that light back to ourselves. You know how many times I was asked coming back into Mount Vernon by people more worldly minded or denominational minded, have you found you a congregation yet? Do you have you a church yet? Whose church is it? It's Christ's church. And we are all to be in this together under the leadership of our elders. We must also be concerned about our ambitions. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3 says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing inherently wrong with being ambitious, right? But if our ambitions are going in the wrong direction and you think about Absalom's and where his ambition was, it can be extremely destructive and have devastating effects. It can either lead you down a path of success or it can lead you right off of a cliff. It depends on where your ambitions are focused. You know, one of our presidents said this. He said, I would rather be a little nobody than an evil somebody. I would rather be a little nobody than to be an evil somebody. You know who that was? Abraham Lincoln. Guess what? He was killed by an evil somebody. But that was the mindset, right? I would rather be a little nobody than to be an evil somebody. Now, don't get me wrong, with our ambitions, yes, they can be good. And as a matter of fact, our eldership is looking for people who have good ambition, who want to serve, who want to lead, right? Who want that position of leadership so that they can train them up and they can ready them for the responsibility. Now you think about Absalom. If his ambitions would have been better, do you think it would have helped his relationship with David? It had to have, right? Yet we get this idea of I need to present myself, I need to put myself out there in the light. I need people to be focused on me. How many congregations did Paul establish in his time? Did he have his name? What size font do you think he used to put his name on the signs out front? Right? Did it say in Romans chapter 16 and verse 16, the churches of Paul greet you? The churches of Christ, right? He recognized that him and Apollos were nothing. They were no more than servants. They did the planting, they did the watering, but God gave the increase. We need to make sure that we're not trying to project ourselves out there and seeking the limelight, but rather making sure we're paying attention to the proper order that our eldership is ruling over us, that they are guiding us in a way that God would have them to. But look at verse 2. Look at verse 2. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was, whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, what city are you from? And he would say, your servant is from such and such tribe of Israel. Don't divert people away from the leadership. Now this was a calculated effort right here. He's standing in a very calculated position. He's not here by happenstance, no more than he traveled with 50 men by happenstance, right? He had thought this out. He had planned this, and now he's in this position so that he can actually lead people away from King David. We cannot allow ourselves to have a mindset to divert people away from the leadership. Yes, we must be concerned about our brethren. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good, especially to those who are of the household of faith. And we will have plenty of opportunities to help our brethren. But shame on us if they are trying to go to the leadership and we swiftly come right into position, take them, put our arms around them, and lead them in a different direction so that we can give them the information that they're seeking. We need to make sure that we are encouraging people to go to our elders so that they have that relationship, that close relationship that God desires for them to have. And we must also be concerned enough to guide them in that direction. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17 says, they are the ones who are watching out for our souls. They care about your soul. They want you and this whole congregation to make it to heaven. And they're taking that responsibility on, and they don't take that responsibility on lightly. We need to make sure that we are trying to lead people in the direction to the leadership. Now, when people went seeking the king, Absalom changed the course. Right? You look at a railroad track and you have this position where there's a lever you can pull and you can shift the direction, right? You can change the path of that train. Here's Absalom. He's in this position. He's strategically planned this out, and he's gotten this position. He sees the people coming and he shifts the tracks. He shifts the tracks on them and he turns them in a different direction rather than turning them to the king. You know how easy this would be to do? How often is it that someone wants to speak to leadership and it might make them nervous? Do you think the people were nervous to have to take their claims to King David? It had to be a little bit nerve-wracking, right? It shouldn't be the case, but sometimes people are more nervous to go to our elders than they are to other brethren with their problems. And then if we're in this position where all of a sudden we say, hey, come on aside, let me talk to you about this, we shift the tracks. We divert them from going to the eldership when we should be leading them to the eldership. You know, you think about it in the business world, and maybe this is the case. Maybe we're more business-minded. When I worked with JH3, I wanted it to be where when I left my guys on the job site, they could handle any given situation. If problems arise, I wanted them to be able to handle it. If I was gone and they had to call me, I would have to leave what I was doing, go all the way to where they were at, then take care of the situation and go back to where I was at. Just the same with my dad. He wanted us to be able to handle our job site so that we didn't have to call him and say, hey, come over here, we need you for this, we need you for that. Next thing you know, he's running around like crazy. We want the problem handled before it reaches the leadership. It's just the opposite as it relates to spiritual matters. We need to make sure that we're helping people get to the leadership and getting the instruction that they need because they care for their souls. Don't cut them off. Don't change their course. Look at verse 3. It says, then Absalom would say to him, look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you. Don't focus on the negative. Don't focus on the negative. Look, there are enough negative Nancys and grumpy Gus's in the world around us. We don't need them in the congregation or the Lord's church just the same. Don't focus on the negative. And that's exactly what Absalom's doing. Don't get me wrong. Maybe it is the case. This is not King David's best time. This is not the best years of his reign. Maybe it is that he has this fault about him where he's not actually taking care of these claims as he should. But the first thing that Absalom does, he pulls these people aside. He gets their attention. He lends them an ear. He's showing like he cares for this. And the first thing he does is point out a fault of the king. The very first thing he does. We need to be more focused on the good. Look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8 with me. Turn over to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. We need to be people who are focused on the good and not solely focused on the negative things. The Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, he starts this, he says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true. So it's not the mindset that we're going to sweep things under the rug. It's not the mindset that we're not going to address things that are wrong. But he says, I want you to focus on things that are true. Whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report. If there is any virtue and if there is any praise, anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Focus on the good. What happens when we continually focus on the negative? We become a very negative people, right? We become hyper-focused on the negative to the point that we can't see the good in people anymore. Paul, of all people, we talked about this morning, all the persecution that he endured and all the things that he endured in his lifetime. How often do you hear the Apostle Paul complaining in his letters? All about joy. All about joy. You know, we could easily pick each other apart if we wanted to. Each one of us, the people that we know the best, we could pick them apart so fast we would be nothing more than a pile of crumbs on the floor if we really wanted to, honestly, right? You think about a marriage. You could take a marriage that is thriving and growing and just doing wonderful, and you could turn that around in a heartbeat. You could turn it to a marriage that is in shambles, and all you have to do is make one person or both hyper-focused on the negative. As soon as one in the marriage decides that I'm only going to focus on the negative things of my spouse, guess what? It's all downhill from there. You lose sight of the good things. You're solely focused on the negative. You think about it in like counseling or something for couples. When they first come in, it's okay, you need to tell her, she needs to, right? Or you need to tell him, he needs to focus on the negative. Rather than say, you know what? I could probably do this, or I could probably do that, and it would probably help us out greatly, right? We all make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. We can't focus on the negative so much that we lose sight of the good things. But not only focus on the good things, give recognition to the good. Give recognition to the good. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17, let elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor. Look, we all have our areas of weakness. All of us. Every single one of us have areas of weakness. And if somebody sat and nitpicked us apart, they could do so by pointing out our areas of weakness. But we need to be more focused on the good and give recognition to the good areas. You know, it's almost like God had this planned out to perfection. When he designed the church itself and he put it to where it was a plurality of men to be in eldership. You know why? Well, one of my thoughts, I guess, if you have one man who's strong in this area, but yet you have another man who's weak in that area, what do they do to each other? How's that work? Right? It evens it out, right? One feeds off of the other and they can help each other. Maybe you have one who is real quick to make a decision while another is very long-suffering, and the two kind of balance each other out, and it makes for a better eldership. And the more men that you have, the more characteristics and the more abilities that they have, they together can make a greater eldership. Now, don't get me wrong, all their character is to be rooted in a life like that of Christ, right? But each and every one of them has a different skill set and different abilities. We need to make sure that we're looking at the positive things rather than being so focused on the negative that we're trying to pick them apart. We recognize the things that they do good and give attention to the things that they do good rather than being focused only on the negative things. Try and give honor where honor is due. Look at verse 4. Moreover, Absalom would say, oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, and I would give him justice. Don't be an if man, right? Don't be the if man who sits aside and every time a decision is made, as soon as it goes wrong, oh, if I would have made that decision, oh, if I was in charge, oh, if I, right? Anybody can do that, right? We can always go and look back at hindsight and we can look at the situation and try and say, well, it would have been better to do it this way. Look, forget about hindsight. When the decision is made, the ability to look into the future and see what might come of it is not there. The choice is made, hopefully, always in the will of God and what is best for the entirety of the congregation. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13, one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. Now, we understand what Paul's talking about in this context, and he's talking about the life that he once lived. And he says, those things are no longer, they're rubbish to me, right? I no longer look to those things, but now this life in Christ, that's what I long for, that's what I yearn for, that's all I want. But we could also make this apply as it relates, forget about the past. Quit thinking about the past and look to the future. Because when we start to have the if-man mentality, we can pick an eldership apart. If a plan works well, how many ifs follow? Nobody has anything to say if a plan works well, right? If it works well, there's no ifs. Now, the if man thrives in private conversation. And this is one we all have to be concerned about. We really need to be concerned about it. Because you can have a decision that's made in the congregation, and maybe you don't agree with it wholeheartedly, right? And maybe you don't talk to the eldership about it. And you find yourself in a situation with another member. And you're sitting there and you say, I just don't know if I can agree with that. If I was leading, I would probably do it this way, or I would do it that way, right? You know what that's actually doing? You know what the leading cause of leadership being undermined is? Broken trust. When we stand there and we say, I would do it this way, or it should have been done that way, what we're actually doing, we're breaking the trust between the people in the leadership. All of a sudden, it's starting to put seeds of doubt in their mind, like, well, maybe it should have been done differently, right? Rather than actually thinking about the whole situation. Rather than saying, you know what? They didn't have hindsight when they made the decision. All decisions are not easy. And especially if you take a decision that's made to try and be right for 50 to 100 people, it's not always going to work out for everybody. Right? We need to make sure that we're not being that if man in those private conversations. But we need to be honest with the situation. James chapter 1 and verse 19, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Let us think about it before we just start blurting things out. Let us really consider the situation and be honest with it. In any given situation, someone sitting on the outside, looking at a decision that was made and the effects that might happen from it, how often do they actually have every factor that was taken into consideration to make that decision when they begin to make the ifs? It's not likely. Absalom has this one thing that he's pointed out that is a fault, and he's changed their attention, and he's made them think more negatively of them. And now he's saying, I will give them justice. Let's be honest about the situation. Can he take justice? It's like he's got it in a goodie bag, right? And he's like, here, have some justice. Have some justice. Have some justice. Is it that easy? Is it really that easy to make everything right? It's a whole lot harder than that. But he's saying, look, if I were judge, I would toss justice out to everybody. Everybody would get justice, right? Be honest about the situation. There's a lot more that goes into things than sometimes we give credit. Be honest about the situation. One last thing. Look at verse 5 and 6. And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner Absalom acted toward all Israel, who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Don't be insincere. Don't be insincere. Let the intent of your heart be just as clear as your actions and just as clear as your words. Don't be insincere. Do you see what Absalom's doing in this situation? This was very thought out, this entire thing. And remember, he just got back in the good graces of David, right? He couldn't even come before David up until this point. And now he's back in David's good graces, and what does he immediately do? He gets his chariots, he gets his horses, he gets his 50 men, his parade, his entourage to run before him. So he can get the people to thinking, okay, yeah, this is a man of leadership. This guy right here, he could be a king. He gets that in their mind, and then he goes to this specific location, not by happenstance. He knows where the people travel to go to the king with the cause, and he waits there, and he cuts them off. And it's almost like you can see him taking them around, putting his arm around him and saying, now come on, let's talk about this, right? Let's go talk about this. So much to the point, even when they kneel down to bow down to him, oh no, don't do that, don't do that. Get back up. And then he kisses them. Don't be insincere. Eliminate false humility. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 33, before honor is humility. Right, he wanted the honor. Absalom wanted the honor, right? He wanted to be projected out there in front of the king. He wanted the honor. But what is supposed to come first? Humility. Proverbs 15:33, before honor is humility. Yet he wanted the honor, but without humility. He was everything that the people needed him to be to execute his plan to perfection. If you look back at chapter 13 and verse 25 of 2 Samuel, it says, now in all of Israel there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. You had better believe he was using every possible thing to his advantage, and this was part of it. He knew how to talk to the people. He knew how to communicate with the people, and he was being very unsincere, and he was projecting out this sense of humility while it was all false. He was pretending. And you look how much effort he put into turning the people away from the king. And what does he do? He steals the hearts of the people. Eliminate deceptive communication. Everything that he told them was for fulfilling the plan that he had in overturning the leadership. Now, Psalm chapter 52 and verse 2 says, your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Look, Absalom was cutting through paper with a razor. He was slicing through this situation, and it was falling out just like he wanted it to, and he was undermining the leadership, and he did it intentionally. That's exactly what he wanted. He wanted to undermine the leadership, and he wanted David's position. Now, like I said when we started, I don't think any of us would ever intentionally try and undermine our leadership. But have we had conversations at times where it's like, you know what, if I would have been there, if I would have made the decision, and we start sowing those seeds of doubt in people's mind. We start pulling the trust away from the leadership and making people think, you know what, maybe there is a different way. Maybe at times we've tried to project ourselves out there rather than recognizing, hey, we're just all humble servants. And we're serving in this congregation under the leadership of our elders. Their responsibility is to lead us and to guide us and to keep us safe, right? That's they're watching out for our souls. I don't think any of us would intentionally do it, but it can easily be done just the same unintentionally. If done right, we can help our leadership, and the lesson that Preston's going to give is going to show some of the positive aspects of how we can actually help them out, and how we can make their work somewhat easier. It's not easy, but we can hopefully make it somewhat easier, and hopefully we can make it more enjoyable for them. Don't let us treat our leadership like Absalom treated the king. Remember, this was his father. This was his own father, and he was undermining him like this. Let us love our eldership and treat them with honor and respect and follow the normal order that God has established. This morning, this is a lesson that's a little bit different, but we also recognize that it's not only in these places that we might fail. Yes, we can struggle and we can actually turn our leadership upside down in our efforts if we're not careful. But we also have other areas in our life where we struggle with sin, and here's the opportunity this morning. Make yourself right. Take the opportunity and make yourself right with God. If you have sin in your life, it separates you from God. None of us want to be separated from God. All of us want to make sure that we hear, well done, thy good and faithful servant. If you've not yet been baptized into the body, we can teach you what it means to be a member of the Church of Christ, what it means to be in the body of Christ. Whatever needs you might have, whether it's something that you need to come forward this morning and you need prayers for, or maybe it's something that you can handle right there in your pew. If we can help you in any way, please let it be known as together we stand as we sing.